Good morning. Good morning to everybody that's joined us on the call. Good morning to all our brokers joining us from near and far. Please let us know in the chat or in the Q&A where you guys are joining us from. We're about to kick off. Just waiting for a few more people to join and waiting for 10 o'clock. Then we'll kick off this webinar with Daniel Silk. Morning, Caesar. Good morning, Snetemba. Would you like to say good morning to all of our brokers? Caesar and Snetemba are just blue ticking me, guys. Good morning. Good morning. Will everybody just let me know if you can see the chat and if you're able to interact with us on the chat, and then we'll get going. Caesar, please confirm if you can see the chat on your side. Can you see the Q&A? There's something on the Q&A I see.
Yes, we have a couple of good mornings coming through.
Okay, amazing. I see Anonymous is saying good morning. Oh, hey, Jaden. Jaden, if you could just drop us your email address on the side so that we can get your CPD points through to you. I see you've logged in as Anonymous. Good morning, Charmaine from Cape Town. Good morning, Lynette. Morning, George. I saw yesterday I was on a call with somebody from Cape Town, and Cape Town was having Joburg weather, and Joburg has been having Cape Town weather. So Cape Townians that are on the call, please come back to collect your weather. We've enjoyed the rain, but it's a bit too much now. Good morning. Is anybody else joining from outside of Johannesburg and outside of Cape Town? Anybody from the rest of Africa? We had our second unconference last week, and we had about 500 attendees on Thursday. Some of them were coming from Zambia, some from Botswana, some from Kenya and Namibia. So it was lovely to see all of you guys. I'm hoping that you are joining us on our iTOOsdays as well. And if there's anybody on the call that missed the iTOOsdays and that missed our unconference and now is suffering from FOMO, fear not, we will have some of these sessions on our iTOOsday. So just keep your eyes peeled and your inbox checked for all of our invites. Okay, so without wasting any further time, I'd like to welcome Mr. Daniel Silk. So Daniel is no stranger to iTOOsdays. We've had Daniel on iTOOsdays before. I think it was way back in 2022, Daniel, if I'm not mistaken. And you gave us a nice overview of the political landscape at that point in time and what we could do to prepare as business. And today, Daniel is back just to give us, again, global themes in these uncertain times. And I think one thing we can be very much certain about is that uncertainty and change is something that we get to live with possibly for the rest of our lives. But I'd like to welcome Daniel, and I'm handing over to Daniel now, who will take us through the rest of the talk. If you've got any questions for Daniel, please pop them in the Q&A, and my team and I will take the questions and pose them through to Daniel. And if there's anything else that you'd like to chat about, please feel free on the Q&A or even in the chat box. We'll keep an eye open for that. Thank you, Daniel. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Trust you can all hear me and see the slide on the screen. That's much more attractive than watching my face for sure. Good morning, everybody. Lovely to be at another iTOOsday. It's been a long time. I know very often, clients of mine say, well, they can only take me in small doses. So it's nice to be back after a couple of years break with you, and what a couple of years it's been. I'm going to give you a sort of a macro overview of some of the big global themes that we are watching. I must tell you, I've been in this game a long time doing political and economic broad-based analysis. And I don't think anybody in this game has experienced such a level of volatility and uncertainty as Tove has said in the beginning, the uncertainty is at really at extreme levels. And, you can choose your own ending. You can choose how this is all going to end, because I don't think any analyst, frankly, is going to get it right, given the current amount of volatility that there is. You can give a presentation starting now at 10 o'clock. Frankly, the world can change by 11 o'clock. So, let's see how it goes, and let's see all of the issues that I want to raise with you. Quite a few. I'm going to deal with any number of issues. Clearly, it's been a roller coaster ride, I think, for everybody watching world events, geopolitics, geopolitical risks, economic risk. This has been a remarkably difficult period. It hasn't just been in the course of the last few months or so. It's also been a difficult period coming out of COVID. I think the last time I spoke, it was, really in COVID, or as we were perhaps beginning to turn the corner. When you look in retrospect, that major event of the pandemic had multitude of effects. They had an effect on all of us as human beings and how we coped with the pandemic. It also had an effect on how voters saw their leadership. It also had an effect on how the economies of the world were affected as a result of COVID, and the management of those economies as we moved out of the pandemic. And some of the uncertainty and volatility that you do see today, I think, is a reflection of this high level of the post-pandemic world and the way we've tried to grapple with that. So, these big historic events, and the pandemic was an incredibly historic event for all of us. It's just like the Second World War, have political fallout. And I still think much of that fallout is playing itself through economically, or at least amongst electorates across the world. Now, we've seen in the course of the last year, voters in many parts of the world reject existing leadership and call for substantial change. And, more and more global leaders have been scratching their head, I suppose, either with a headache or not quite sure as to how they managed to lose their respective elections or the confidence of their voters. I mean, out of, all of this lot, yes, the Japanese prime minister is still there. The French Macron is holding on to power, but it does look brittle. But when you look at leadership changes in the big important countries, certainly in the west of the UK, the US, and Germany more recently, clearly voters are reacting. They're reacting to high interest rates. They're reacting to frustrations with inflation and the basket of goods just becoming more expensive. They're reacting to issues relating to personal insecurities, to migration, to crime and terrorism. All of these issues really coming to the fore. Incumbents are being beaten all across the world. And in the German election just last week, again, you saw the continued trend of the rise of the European right wing, and quite an extreme right wing at that. And we are seeing this trend. You're going to see this trend across the rest of Europe. Liberal leaders, left of center leaders, they are on the back foot as conservative and ultra-conservative or right-wing parties gain ground. So, it's been a really rough ride. We're in a kind of environment where, analysts like to coin fancy words for these things. Polycrisis, a simultaneous occurrence of several catastrophic events that have been occurring really ever since COVID. And those catastrophic events are playing themselves out right now. The war in the Ukraine, the debilitating and very unpleasant conflict between Israel and Hamas, which has polarized so much of the world as well. These are two enormous issues that have created an unsettled feeling for everyone. The knock-on effect of the pandemic, which saw logistics, the shipping lanes of the world under strain, have been replaced now by global terrorism, by global conflict, which has caused tremendous bottlenecks in key transport routes across the world. And again, it's a feature of the world when you look at, how you plan for the future and how you source product in the future. This uncertainty when it comes to vital shipping passages across the world really means that for businesses, finding alternative supply chains is really going to be a feature. It wasn't just a feature during the pandemic when our supply chains were blocked. It's now potentially a feature of the world as these multitude of crises play themselves out in critical areas: Red Sea, Indian Ocean, Panama Canal. South China Sea. One could name just a few, and the potential geopolitical risks that go with that as well, all against the background and backdrop of continued climate change. And that climate change, of course, leads to populations looking for better resources, more displaced populations, particularly on our continent as well. And we are seeing a huge amount of displaced people. I've been talking about this for years. People said, well, it all sounds rather theoretical. But people are moving across the world. They're moving for more opportunity. Yes, they're moving away from conflict. Yes. But in Africa, they're moving across borders where there's water, where there's better grazing opportunities for their cattle, and where there's perhaps less damage to soil than there is in parts of the African continent. So we have to flag these issues. These are big theme issues that have been with us and are going to be with us for some time. So if they're going to be with us for some time, and I think, Tom, you mentioned we're in a kind of permanent, crisis mode in a sense, a perma-crisis world. Gone from poly-crisis world, those crises are not really going away, and if they do go away, they might be replaced by others, but we're now in something of a perma-crisis world where we all simply have to understand that these are strategic threats to business, and we have to find ways and means of ameliorating the threats, or at least finding alternative options that can safeguard our businesses and, for that matter, our personal lives as well. Now, fun slide, of course, for some. That certainly the recent second term of President Donald Trump has contributed, by and large, to a fair amount of uncertainty in the global context right now. And Trump's accession to power, with just under 50% of the vote, by the way, in the United States, is an important point to make, is because although the Republicans did very well by picking up the House and the Senate, Trump's popular vote was just under 50%. Which does mean that some of his policies may well not resonate with elements who perhaps even voted for him, making for, I think, a more vulnerable presidency than Trump would certainly acknowledge. But Trump's accession to power occurs at a time when there are great global rivalries in the world. They've been with us for some time. They've been with us probably always, frankly. But these global rivalries are now playing themselves out, or potentially playing themselves out, in rather a different manner to before the Trump victory, and we'll go through some of those aspects. There's no doubt that the Trump administration is looking for a closer strategic partnership with Vladimir Putin's Russia, and this is having a dramatic effect on global relations and potentially a dramatic effect on aspects of the global economy as well, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So, at the heart, I'm a political analyst. I do, of course, what I call political economy analysis, the effects of politics on the economy, and the effects of the economy on politics, because politics and economics now is more closely interrelated than ever before. And when we look back at the post-Second World War environment for the world, it was a post-Second World War in which the United States was the dominant political player. With the Soviet Union, two dominant players came to the fore in a bipolar world. With the rise of China, we've had a multipolar world. And in fact, there are more countries across this world, more developing, more emerging market countries who have grown their economies and have also grown their defenses over the last number of years. In a sense, it's no longer the US is the only game in town. Some refer this as to a G0 world in which there's no superpower who sets the rules. It's a world without rules, and it's almost the survival of the fittest. And when you look at some of these issues that have been creeping into the Trump presidency just in the course of the last few weeks or so, Trump is playing that game in a sense. It is survival of the fittest, and the fittest will do what they need to do to get results. Loyalties don't necessarily matter. Friendships don't necessarily matter. You look after your own, and you'll do what you need to do to look after your own. In a sense, we are seeing the sort of political theory that many of us have been talking about for any number of years really playing itself out right now. I mean, just to all of you, you are seeing history in the making. It is a consequential period for all of us in the world, whether you're sitting, frankly, in Durban or Dublin, in Bloemfontein or in Belfast. It is consequential for all of us. And we are all locked into this complex puzzle of which the pieces sometimes fall out and the pieces sometimes fit back in together. Across the world, we've seen the big global powers. You can see on the map there, the big global powers have had sort of sway. There are other very important regional powers as well. Yes, South Africa is a regional power for sure. India has become a very important power. Iran, Turkey is a big player certainly in that part of the world. Brazil in Latin America. There are other games in town as well. It's not just the US and it's not just Russia, it's not just China. There are other games, there are other economic friendships that are being established, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. But of course, it's been Donald Trump, and it's all been Donald Trump in a sense over the course of the last month or so. And more importantly, I suppose, dealing with the Ukraine issue and with the Europe issue, it's been Donald Trump's desire to move closer to Putin's Russia that has, I think, been a destabilizer of the world order that we had kind of got used to since the fall of the Berlin Wall. I mean, the Berlin Wall was important because we all thought the world was going to be more peaceful. Liberal democracy would win. Russia would not be as keen on expansionism as she was when she was the old Soviet Union. And yet, of course, those analysts have been proven somewhat wrong. And we're moving into a complex slide. I just want to go through some of these issues because, again, the political side of this backdrop is very important. We are moving into what really is called a multipolar world where we are, in a sense, multipolarized. Good heavens. I mean, you need a drink, by the way. I can't see you, but I can't see what you're doing with your hip flask, frankly, at your desk. And sometimes you do need a drink to get through these dramatic changes that are occurring. This has been a period, and just a short period, just over the last month, in which we've shifted from this US-led world to something else that I think is still in the process of defining itself. It does look as though it's a world where there will be increasing ideological, economic, and geopolitical competition in various regions and sponsored by various major countries as well. The United States, we know, is looking to shore up its own economic success, the Make America Great scenario. For China, China is probably going to continue to look at developing relations with the developing world, including Africa, or what we call in the political science game, the global south, southern hemisphere countries, more or less. The European Union is caught really in the middle of the storm, caught between the United States, less keen on supporting the EU, and a European Union also watching the rise of China and the rise of certain Russia encroaching upon Ukraine and Central Europe as well. And Russia, of course, a wild card factor looking to restore her lost glory, her lost empire as well. All of these issues now just coming to the fore in the last month or so. So we can expect increased conflicts and risks. We can expect more trade wars and economic fragmentation. I'll come back to that in a moment, all against this background of the cost of climate change and how many more resources we need globally to combat this. The sad part about it, and climate change is an important issue to me, is that the world is polarizing when we all need to work together on big issues of hunger, poverty, inequality, climate change. And there is a rise of right-wing populism and nationalism. You've seen it in the US, you've seen it in Germany and other parts of the world as well. So there are various scenarios. We can look at them. I won't go into too much detail here, but you can either see this world situation in a glass half full version, which is increasingly difficult, I must tell you, because the world doesn't look as though it's going to cooperate as closely as it has been. Or you can look at a more pessimistic scenario in which there's more disorder in the world and more great power conflict. You can be the judge of where that is, but frankly, we're almost a little too soon to make any call on whether we're looking at the worst case scenario, the best case scenario, or probably a scenario in between where there are still conflicts, but hopefully there will still be cooperation. What we do know is that the coming together of the world, the sort of globalization of the world, that period seems to have ended. We are more fragmented, and we are certainly looking at aspects of what we saw before in the Cold War, this fragmentation, ideological confrontation playing itself out in parts of the world. Now, from the United States point of view, they have a new sheriff in town, as they have said themselves in no particular language. And I think for Donald Trump, it's also important to try and understand what does he actually want? What is he thinking? I mean, I don't know Donald Trump, so I can't get into his head. But I think if you look at some of those big picture issues, here's a guy who likes the limelight. And he likes the control, and he likes to be able to say, look, these issues revolve around me and only I can solve these issues. So I think there is an element of power, the power of the sheriff in the White House, in the Oval Office, is part of the psyche there. I think there's an element of the reality TV star, which is very much part of the way Donald Trump operates as well. He's very open to putting his feelings out on media. You've seen more press conferences from Trump in the last month than I think you saw from Joe Biden over the last 4 years or so. And Trump, of course, looks for ratings. He says outlandish things. And there is that reality star built into him as well. But I think the more important aspect of Trump to me is that he is he's what they call transactional. The way he works looks as though he puts forward a particular deal in the hope that he'll get something from that deal. He'll start with some sort of outlandish bid or gambit, may water it down, but nevertheless, this is the style of leadership that he does apply. He's a transactional leader. And again, it's not about being loyal to your friends. It's about what you can get out of the deal. And that really is what a transactional leadership style in politics is in this particular instance. He is aided and abetted, of course, by this new feature of US politics. I'll come to why it's not a new feature in other parts of the world in a moment. But in the US, you've got, of course, our South African-born Elon Musk, who has been, of course, financed a large part of Trump's campaign, but is close to Trump and has been entrusted with cutting the red tape and cutting the bureaucracy. Of course, there's nothing wrong with cutting bureaucracy. We need a bit of that in this country. But if you're going to do it with a sledgehammer, you are looking for problems. And I think we are looking for problems down the line on this particular issue. Nevertheless, the cooperation between Trump and the richest man in the world brings a different tone to politics. It's not just about elected officials anymore. Trump has appointed Musk to a very senior position to cut red tape. He's not elected. And if he's not elected, this can cause friction with those politicians who have been elected as well. So I flagged this issue. It may be running relatively smoothly now, but I think this is an issue that could come back to bite Donald Trump over the next few years. But the reality from a US point of view and from a global economic point of view is that there's a huge amount of United States debt. They've been borrowing more and more money, as the graph would indicate, and they have to, in some form or other, reduce their debt. There's the potential of a debt crisis, which could lead to a financial crisis in future. The US could default on debt repayments. Debt repayments cost the US a fortune. So, what do? You try to cut costs in a sledgehammer kind of way, granted, which Musk is doing. You also try to perhaps also devalue the dollar over time so that your dollar-denominated debt is that bit weaker. And I think we are likely to see that as something of an ideal from the Trump administration over the next couple of years or so. But I flag this issue because dealing with the US debt is important. And you also, how do you finance debt? Well, you introduce tariffs and you collect trillions of dollars through the introduction of tariffs. And I think there's something in the justification for tariffs from the Trump perspective is that you can rake in or reel in all of that cash from tariffs, and that can be used in some way or other to offset this rising and rather disturbing graph of US debt going forward. So look, what an unusual vision, I suppose, to have Musk at the most senior levels of power in the United States. Remember, Musk can't become president because he wasn't born in the United States, but he can have his little kid in the Oval Office as well as he deals with some of the most important issues in the United States. Now, Musk just reminds me a little bit, of our issue of state capture in South Africa, where the increasing importance of very wealthy, moneyed individuals played themselves out politically at the top echelons of government. And when that happens, politicians give way to contracts and requests coming from those wealthy elites. And in this case, in South Africa, we all know the requests and concessions that the Guptas elicited from the Zuma administration. So frankly, we could very well argue that there is a degree of, well, I'm not going to call it state capture, but some might call it capture of the state by private interests, when private interests become very important and can influence policy going forward, and of course the extension of contracts as well. And we've seen this in other parts of the world. It's not just a South African phenomenon during the Zuma years. We've seen it in Russia, certainly, where the oligarchs play a very important role. And Trump might find that quite appealing because some of his wealthy, moneyed supporters and backers may well want those benefits from being so closely linked to the state. We see it in Turkey, Brazil, Mexico, and many other parts of the world as well. Trump has been governing in the last month or so by executive order, more or less. Most of these issues haven't even gone through proper debates in the US Congress. He has the power to do that, and the Democrats look extremely weak in holding him to account. He has also gone further, again, by cutting aid into most of the developing world. And remember, this is also a cost-saving measure. Doesn't matter that aid, of course, is humanitarian. It doesn't matter to Trump that aid provides the United States with an important soft power influence lever. It cuts costs for the United States, and with a stroke of a pen, much of this aid has disappeared, and you've seen the effect certainly in parts of Africa as well. So there is a sense of the global order unraveling. It's unraveling in the way that we were used to it. And you've seen it just on your TV sets in the course of the last couple of days. I mean, it's so strange giving a talk like this when you see some of these themes and trends developing in front of your eyes in real time. The dressing down of Zelensky by Trump again shows Trump's movement away from supporting Ukraine, and clearly also a movement away from attaching himself to the security concerns of Europe and NATO as well. I think what is uppermost in the mind of the Republicans and Trump is a threat, and the threat of China going forward. I think that is something that the Republicans will be looking at as what can they do to soften China as a threat. And we've seen just also in the course of the last week, the new US Secretary of State almost justify the closer friendship with Putin by saying that the US can't let Russia become China's junior partner. It looks as though the Trump administration would like Russia to become Trump's junior partner, to pry them away from the influence of China and what is perhaps a new world order according to China, in diminishing the power of the United States. So these suggestions, I'm giving you a number of suggestions as to why we are seeing these shifts across the world, are playing themselves out right now. We can only go by what these politicians say to a degree. And I think this is a very telling statement from Rubio that this friendship with Russia might have economic interests, ideological interests, but perhaps repositioning the world away from the potential of Chinese power in future may be a reason for this close association with Trump. And the question remains, can Trump divide Russia and China? Can he pry Russia away from that Russia-China axis that has been forming over the last few years or so? Some might argue that what we are seeing is a carving up of the world. You remember, if you went back to your history books, how Africa was carved up, and the Belgians got this lot, and the French got that lot, and the British got that lot. Maybe we're seeing some sort of large carve up of the world where Trump brings the Russians in. He gives them some leeway in Central Europe. And of course, Trump has the power and leeway in the Western Hemisphere as well, leaving China a little bit more isolated. But China may not be so isolated in terms of her ability to reach out to other countries. And I'll come back to that as well. Global power relations, therefore, have been changing. It was pretty grim between Zelensky and Trump, but it was certainly much more friendly between Zelensky and the British Prime Minister Starmer over the course of the weekend. And you are just seeing this issue polarize Europe, polarize and divide Europe between or against the United States. And this is really what I think the key feature of what we're seeing in global relations. Europe can no longer specifically rely upon the US for her security needs. And Europe now certainly is going to have to buck up, spend a lot more money on defense going forward. And you've seen that coalition of European leaders, or what's referred to as the coalition of the willing, now formed to provide the security mechanisms for Zelensky that the United States won't provide. A dramatic change as well. And it goes again to Trump's dislike or lack of interest in financially supporting NATO into the future. The Europeans largely now, I think, whilst they may not be completely on their own, they're more on their own than ever before. And strange as it might be, Keir Starmer, who doesn't look as though he's particularly effective in camouflage uniforms, may well be the new leader of the sort of non-US Western grouping in the world. Gosh, what change. Let's have a look at the global economy quickly amidst all of this. Amidst all of this, and we are going to see shifts in the global economy as a result of these big geopolitical risk factors, because these are dramatic. So the forecasts for the global economic projections for the next year or two are really forecast without taking into effect the real possible issues relating to global political risk, as I've mentioned to you. For the advanced economies of this world, growth is going to be relatively pedestrian, as you can see by those middle three charts there. These are the latest projections from the IMF, I should say. And for this year, we are going to see, 1.9% growth for advanced economies. Next year, similar. And for emerging market economies, much better, I might add. And we, of course, are part of that, or at least the African continent is. South Africa lagging to some degree. But nevertheless, you can just see there's a big difference here between the emerging market economies looking stronger. There's advanced economies looking, they're in positive territory, but they're not particularly exciting. If we quickly look to see at some of the countries and who's really going to do well, quickly have a look at the top of that chart there. You can see in the United States, 2025's GDP figures are not completely in, they're still forecasts. The US was the star performer from the Western countries without a shadow of a doubt in the recovery after the pandemic. US growth is expected to slow. Now, these are sort of the macro projections before some of the other issues that I'm going to deal with, like tariffs. Whatever the case, the US is expected to slow in its growth, but according certainly to the IMF, still be relatively strong. The euro area looks as though it's going to be really weak. The German economy is flatlined. French economy is particularly dull. Italy's been a little bit okay. The Spanish economy has been the star performer in Europe, by the way. The UK economy, flatlined. They got excited because they had about 0.2% growth in the last quarter of last year. Good heavens, even we do better than that. China, and I'll come back to China in a moment, steady as she goes, but at lower levels. India remains the star performer. When you look at these big countries, developing country, India is likely to grow at over 6% again in 2025. That's an impressive growth story for any country, especially one of 1.4 billion people. South Africa's growth rate, languishing at 1.5% or so. And, we'll come back to that also in a moment. The big, I suppose, unknown, and it's a big unknown as to how it will affect every part of the world, is this issue of tariffs. It's apt that we do this talk this morning because, as you know, overnight, the 25% tariffs on Canadian imports into the United States and Mexican imports into the United States have taken effect formally. There was no compromise from Trump on that issue. And another 10% was added to Chinese imports coming in from China to the United States. And we are seeing also, it's not just political, it's economic as well. I think there are those in the Trump administration who would like to use tariffs to offset tax as an economic policy. This is a dramatic change. It would be a dramatic experiment, really, in economic theory. Almost not replace, but downgrade the reliance on tax, personal tax, company tax, and replace it with tariff revenues. And again, within the Republican Party, there are those who see this as a future economic policy. And what we may be seeing now is the start of an experiment on this particular issue. It's pretty risky, I must tell you. If it works, well, it may filter through to many other countries, but we'll come back to the issue of tariffs in a moment. Look, we are seeing tariffs now applied across the board. We're going to see tariffs against the EU as well, or certainly parts of the EU on certain goods. It's a different world order. Tariffs, in a sense, to me, are a cost. They're an additional tax. And whilst there may be advantages to lowering tax rates elsewhere, you're going to pay for it as a consumer through tariffs. Good heavens, who's going to absorb a 25% increase in a product coming into the United States? The middleman will go bankrupt if he has to absorb that. So who's going to absorb it? The consumer is going to have to absorb any kind of tariff. And that issue is really, really creating tremendous uncertainty. We can plot uncertainty, and we've seen record uncertainty in economic policy now, even surpassing the uncertainty levels of COVID, 9/11, and the global financial crisis of 2009. That's how uncertain that global economy is at the moment. And I think at the heart of the tariff issue and the heart of what Trump perhaps wants to do is to try and restore some sort of manufacturing balance back to the United States, which has shifted dramatically to China over the last 20 years or so as globalization took root. So Trump would like to see, with the threat of tariffs, all of these companies, many of them, come back into the US, build plants, open those plants, employ Americans, and produce the goods that used to be produced in China or in other parts of the world as well. It is a reversal of outsourcing. It's a reversal of globalization. That's the kind of theory that tariffs bring, other than getting money in to keep the budget deficit in check in future. And I mean, it's fascinating for me to watch. You can just see in the United States, the manufacturing sector has lost a huge amount of employment. Jobs have gone. They've gone to Vietnam, they've gone to Bangladesh, they've gone to Pakistan, they've gone to China. Of course they have. And Trump hopes that those jobs can come back in. But you can't just bring those jobs back quickly. You can't build the factories quickly. You can't retool quickly. And your labor costs in the United States are much higher. So even if there was US domestic production coming into the US, those labor costs are going to keep those goods relatively expensive for the average American. So there is certainly an issue to be of concern about whether this policy can work in future. For the United States, they import much more than they export, and that's the reversal of the line that Trump wants to do. And it is a critical time in the world, perhaps a generational shift for us to look as we move towards deglobalization. Now, the US economy is starting to feel the effects of this. And I'll go through some of these charts quickly. If you can't sleep tonight, I'll give you just some of the edited highlights of the charts. I don't expect you to look at any of them in any detail. Just listen to the story, really. The forward projections for the US economy are weaker as we sit here. And that, again, is a function of the uncertainty about economic policy. American equities or stocks have lost the momentum that they had. Wow, what momentum did they have? You're never going to maintain it over what we've had over the last 18 months. But that momentum is gone. You've seen a very jittery market just overnight. And even European stocks, with all of their lackluster growth, even those stocks are performing better than US stocks. Consumer confidence in the United States is down, and there are rising expectations of inflation in the US, with obviously the potential of higher interest rates as well going forward. Retail sales in the United States are looking less rosy than they were. And I think even from the US dollar perspective, yes, it's a little higher today as a result of the tariff story. We may well see the beginnings of a more sluggish US dollar into the future, which I think Trump ultimately wants. But a sluggish US dollar will also create inflationary pressures in the United States. So good heavens, what a risk Donald Trump is taking. He came to power on the basis of softening inflation, softening the hardship for Americans. And yet this tariff experiment has precisely the danger of raising inflation once again. Okay, that's the US economy where it is at the moment. For China, it's been a simply pretty lackluster affair of sort of stagnating growth down to between 4.5% and 5%, not the days that China used to enjoy. I must tell you, house prices in China continue to fall. Even foreign direct investment into China has fallen, and in fact, foreign investors have removed themselves from China as well. But the Chinese have also been wary of what's coming. They've seen the potential of a trade war that they're locked in right now. They've introduced tariffs just in the last hour on their goods coming into the US in a tit-for-tat kind of reciprocal nature. The Chinese are exporting vast quantities to other parts of the world, and certainly not exporting as much to the United States. The US has weaned themselves off a lot of Chinese imports, and the Chinese have found markets elsewhere. They've found markets, of course, in Africa and across the developing world as well. Let me turn quickly to Africa, by the way. Sheer size of Africa makes it difficult for me even to say something coherent about the continent. But quickly, it's rather complicated. I just want to indicate to you that, the African story, notwithstanding all of this noise that I've said, looks relatively good in selected countries across the world. I mean, you can go through the list and pick out the country where you're from. For the friends here, maybe from Botswana, you're looking at GDP growth of about 4% this year, which is not too shabby at all, especially for us in South Africa, with our less than 1% growth, at least in the last year or so. Our friends in Kenya are looking at a 5% GDP growth this year. Mozambique certainly off the boil because of internal unrest there, just under 4% this year. Namibia, amazingly, looking at about 3.5%. Not too bad, given some of the issues relating to unemployment and drought in that country. Was there in Namibia quite recently. And there's some fantastic success stories. I mean, even Senegal, which has its issues, looking at about 8% GDP growth this year. Ethiopia back on track to some degree. It's over 6% this year. Wow. So there are some really good stories coming out of the African continent. Even Zimbabwe, looking at over 4% GDP growth this year. Again, not too shabby given the history of Zimbabwe and given the global pressures as well. And again, we've seen many of these African countries have their ratings upped ever so slightly in many cases. But we are seeing much better ratings coming from many parts of the African continent as well. Inflation across Africa looking a little bit easier, but food inflation remains very high. And when food inflation remains high, there is always the danger of dissatisfaction on the ground. It's not just that dissatisfaction with corrupt political leaders, but certainly it's dissatisfaction with inflation, the cost of living as well. And we've seen those demonstrations play themselves out in Kenya and in some other parts of the continent as well. But here's a warning. I mean, with all of the issues relating to the big trade issues and all of these tariffs, and with the rise in harmful trade policies, as I've mentioned, Africa tends to suffer more when there is global uncertainty. The vulnerability of African economies don't give them the same suits of armor that other countries have in terms of diversifying production, diversifying sources of imported goods, of having stable currencies. And as a result, global insecurity will also affect our continent at that. And we are likely to see in general, and don't worry about the charts and the graphs, that this level of trade fragmentation and trade war that we are seeing right now today at this time in the world is likely to have a slowing effect on economies just about everywhere. So everyone will not be alone. So lastly, on this particular issue, and it's a very important slide, and I mean, I don't have that much time to deal with all of the matters that I want to deal with here. But I think what's critically important for Africa in particular is to try and find a way to insulate herself from many of these key aspects that I've spoken about. How do you do it? It's easier for, I'm an analyst. It's easy for me to say these things, let me tell you. But there are ways in which Africa can begin to strategize, and have begun already to strategize to protect the continent and protect African economies. And the most important one to me is to promote regional trade agreements. We don't want a fragmented world also being present in Africa. And the whole concept of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is really to bring participating countries closer together with lower tariff barriers. As these tariff barriers rise in other parts of the world, Africa can be the bulwark against this, in a sense, amongst her own membership, her own countries. So promoting these regional trade agreements to me is even more critical than before. Listen, I'm going to get old talking about this issue because there are all sorts of vested interests, national security concerns, nationalism issues, political issues that often prevent African countries from really signing on the dotted line and implementing quickly. But I think given the global issues that I've outlined, this becomes even more importantly. Secondly, Africa needs to strengthen domestic supply chains, relying upon the bigger players and bigger powers, when they are locked or distracted into tariff and trade wars, not to mention security concerns in key shipping lanes across the world, well, that is a recipe also for concern. So domestic supply chains need to be upped. And I think many African countries with the capacity to manufacture as well need to understand that this is an opportunity for them to get their act together. And I look at my own South Africa as a particular example. Thirdly, there is no substitute for public-private partnerships in terms of cooperating on infrastructure projects. We know that the state usually doesn't have the capacity, the skills, the inclination, or the transparency and accountability to engage in large-scale development and infrastructure projects. The private sector critically needed, and making the private sector comfortable and giving them the concessions and guarantees they need, even more critical than before. As I've indicated, supply chains and suppliers need to be diversified. And of course, African countries need to foster as much global financial cooperation as they can. And there may well be opportunities. If you put the United States aside, you're going to find the European Union much more likely to do business with Africa. And you'd likely to see certainly China continue to want to do business across the continent as well. So there is an opportunity. There's an opportunity to improve intra-African trade as well, which has shown that's trade amongst African countries. It's been slow, it's insufficient, but there are improvements in that coming forward. Some of the threats to Africa, which I was mentioned very briefly, Africa has also rising external debt levels of great concern as well. African countries pay record amounts of interest on debt, and very often that interest on debt crowds out critical spending on social services and infrastructure as well. I'm pleased that in the last week or so, last 10 days, we've seen a new financial stability fund be created to try and offset some of the damaging trend lines in terms of this debt. Finally, on the issue of Africa and the world, well, I'm not final. I could go on for the next hour or so, and I want to leave some time for questions. Of course, Africa is going to be affected by a United States that is withdrawing. And the US looks as though it will certainly withdraw from aspects of AGOA. And certainly those countries that are seen as hostile, less friendly to United States interests, are going to bear the brunt of the concessions that AGOA provides. AGOA countries in trade with the United States have been on the rise in the last few years or so, nowhere near what it used to be back in 2010. But Africa needs all the trading opportunities it can get. South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya are the largest AGOA countries to export into the United States market. And certainly, if South Africa is seen as hostile to US interests, this will be felt in South Africa. But of course, you can make up the difference with looking to China for increasing trading opportunities, which may be there. And China has been back in Africa, providing all sorts of trade concessions in advance of the possible withdrawal of the United States. But still, I think this is a challenge for Africa. It's a challenge on all of these issues that I've mentioned. And it's a challenge also when it comes to Africa being a big recipient of US foreign assistance in general. Those countries are going to have to tweak their budgets, are going to have to look for loans elsewhere. But you don't want to look for loans that burden you forever and a day as well. So it really is a tough environment, a rough environment for Africa going forward under these conditions, and despite some good results coming from their countries. Let me just say finally, when it comes to the big picture issues of the continent, I put the slide up, sort of a scramble for Africa. We all remember there have been all sorts of scrambles for Africa in the past, and Africa has been carved up as a result. There's a new scramble for Africa coming. It may be a scramble not just for Africa, but for the Ukraine and other parts of the world as well. The importance of critical minerals and the use of critical minerals in new technologies in particular. Whilst there are many countries in the world that have critical minerals, Africa has them in relative abundance and in certain select areas of the world as well. South Africa has plenty of them. Namibia has lithium. The DRC, of course, a treasure trove of critical minerals, and probably one of the reasons why you are seeing added instability in the DRC right now. Politics and nationalism and tribalism and ethnic conflict play a role, but securing your hands on this vital commodity into the future is going to be a flashpoint, I think, for all of us. So I could go on for some time, and I want to mention one last issue that I think is important for us on the African continent, and I think it's a nice issue perhaps to end on, because I want to leave a couple of moments for questions, and perhaps somebody to ask me about South Africa, because I haven't had time to cover South Africa. But on the African story, I mean, you know, the picture says it all. This is a remarkable continent because of its demographics. And you can say what you like about Europe, you can say what you like about Japan, you can say what you like about Russia, and even China. Those countries are aging, and aging at a rapid rate, particularly China and particularly Europe. And where's the consumer of the future going to be? Where's your client of the future going to be? Your client of the future is really going to be on this continent. Look at those graphics and look at those projections for Africa's population between now and 2050. The rise of young people on this continent, an average age on this continent, by the way, of 18, it's the youngest continent in the world, is nothing short of dramatic, offering tremendous opportunity for everyone in the business sector, and of course challenges. The youth need to be served by responsible, accountable, transparent governments with good policies. So, you know, you can wax lyrical about young people and the role they're going to play, but governments have to be supportive of this. But the big issue for me certainly is that young countries that have high levels of Gen Zs, of which this continent has, are going to be the biggest spenders. The youngest people are going to be the biggest spenders. They will become part of the consumer class, notwithstanding many of the constraints that I've mentioned. And I think these opportunities in Africa, combined with the later infrastructural development that this continent is seeing, high level of urbanization and development of Africa's cities, present substantial opportunities for business across the continent. So I'm a little bit more I think, subdued about the global economy. I'm a little bit subdued about this issue of great power rivalry that I think is going to affect the US economy and perhaps the European economy, because they've got to delve into their pockets and spend billions of dollars more on arms and security now that the United States is not providing those guarantees. I mean, these countries in Europe are going to get themselves into higher levels of debt. They can't tax their populations anymore. It's politically unpopular, and they're highly taxed. They're very highly taxed already. So when you look at those issues affecting the Western world, the developing world, and in particular our continent, becomes to me that little bit more attractive in which to operate. So I'm going to end on this particular slide. It's not the slide I wanted to end on, but I want to take some comments or questions from you. So I do think that for all the sort of pessimism and darkness on some of these bigger picture issues, if we can get it right by strategically positioning this continent to take advantage of the weaknesses that are going to emerge in other parts of the world, I do think that this is an opportunity that we should grab. So amidst all of those challenges, as it is often said, there is opportunity. And I think that opportunity absolutely exists in this part of the world, notwithstanding our particularly sluggish economy in South Africa that frankly needs a policy reboot. And if somebody wants to ask me a question about the fortunes of the South African government and national unity and how that plays into policy arena, please do. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very, very much for that very informative download of information, Daniel. We've got 2 questions on the Q&A, and to everybody that's listening in, if you do have additional questions, please just pop them in the Q&A and we'll pose them to Daniel. So the first question was from Marius, and Marius is asking, with the spat going on between the USA and South Africa, and the consequences it could hold for South Africa, why are BRICS partners silent and not coming out in support of South Africa?
Marius, thank you for the question, and the part of the talk that and I'm going to take my next 5 minutes, frankly, on the issue of BRICS, which is important. Yeah, I think the BRICS organization itself is under pressure, and I think we've seen Donald Trump in particular threaten the BRICS countries that should they pursue any kind of interest in finding some sort of alternative to the US dollar as either a trading currency or a currency of reserve. The BRICS countries have been hinting at this for years, by the way. They've been hinting at moving away from the domination of the global financial order by the West and certainly by the United States. But the Trump administration clearly wishes to retain the ascendancy and importance of the US dollar, and again is threatening BRICS countries with what he said was 100% tariffs should they continue to pursue that. Trump also, just in the course of the last 2 weeks, made the statement that the BRICS are dead, is what he said. And I think he is assuming that his threats are going to undermine the cohesiveness of BRICS themselves. Now, Trump is cozying up, as we've seen, to Russia, Putin. He's certainly been friendly towards the Indian administration as well. And I think, from Trump's perspective, as I've indicated, he's looking to pry away perhaps both India and Russia from the orbit, let us say, of China. And I've always regarded the BRICS groupings really as being the anchor tenant of BRICS really is China, to some degree India as well. But I do somehow feel as though China ultimately calls the shot, given the trading relationship that most of those BRICS countries have with China. I mean, BRICS is really, for most of those BRICS countries, they're the biggest trading partner. So I think that the BRICS countries themselves have been caught off guard. They are perhaps intimidated to react to some of the threats coming from the United States. And they do look as though they are going to be tested as to whether BRICS remains a cohesive power force, a counterbalance, let's say, to the West. But the West is no longer the West as I sit here. The West is the US, separate of the European Union. And the BRICS themselves are going to find that they do have an opportunity to interact with non-US players. The BRICS have an opportunity to interact in closer formation with the European Union. And China will play a role in that. And the EU will be looking also to move closer to trade agreements with China as well. So I think that the BRICS countries are in a state of, I think, uncertainty like every other association. Even the G20 that South Africa is chairing at the moment found herself without representation, senior representation from the United States just last week in Johannesburg and Cape Town. And it does show that the United States looks as though it doesn't wish to participate, or it will attempt to devalue global organizations that it regards as being either anti to US interests or as watering down the power of the United States. And BRICS certainly finds herself in the firing line of that, making it awkward for BRICS countries to speak out on many issues for the moment. And I think BRICS ultimately will need some sort of crisis meeting, just as there's been a crisis meeting on Ukraine, to try and see where BRICS, what kind of role and route BRICS takes in a future with the United States that looks as though it's going to try and damage the cohesiveness of BRICS going forward. Anyway, to follow up, if there's something you want me to add to that, please ask me.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer, Daniel. If there's anything else, Marius, please do pop it into the Q&A again. And then Pete Moritz says USA debt is a big threat to the world, and with Musk tackling it with the sledgehammer, as you said, how would you have tackled it? And with SA being at its lower level in exactly the same predicament?
Well, I think that there's very good theoretical reason to bring manufacturing home. Now, in a strange way, there are similarities between South Africa and the United States. That chart that I showed of the drop-off in employment for manufacturing in the United States, I could show a similar chart in South Africa. Our manufacturing industry remains under extreme pressure. Industries have moved out, they've been offshore, they've gone to China, they've gone elsewhere. So there's good reason for countries to try and incentivize a return to domestic production. I'd like to see it here in South Africa. But the way it should be done is incrementally over a fairly long period of time in a very stable global environment. The problem for the United States is that the antagonism that Trump shows to some of his closest friends and allies really is likely to undermine the ability of the United States to attract sufficient inward investment. There'll be some showpieces, as you've seen in the last week or so. But in the South African case, this is really where the African Union, together with the Continental Free Trade Agreement, really should play its role. We in South Africa, we should be making goods for the rest of the continent. We are undercapacitated in our what we call our capacity utilization in manufacturing in South Africa. We've got spare capacity. We've more or less got skills in order to make goods for other parts of the world, particularly our continent. And if we can guarantee a more tariff-friendly environment across Africa, we should be the hub, and there can be some other hubs as well. Ethiopia could be one of them. Kenya could be one of them. Nigeria, for that matter, who are regional production hubs. And if we can then export our way out of this particular issue, it will reduce our debt levels because of the incomes generated from that. So I would like to see an export-led recovery. It's almost a sort of a reindustrialization policy for South Africa. But, well, you need favorable tariff regimes. Yep. You need good logistics and infrastructure and reliable power. You need good government policies that encourage the private sector. You need stable labor for all of that as well. And there are many other conditions that you need in favor of it. But an export-led recovery, to me, is critical. You can't do this with an import-led story. And I think that is part of the way. There are other solutions, and I haven't got time to mention some other options.
Thank you very much. I think that is very, very informative. And I see there's people and they've asked if we can share this talk with them, but we'll chat with you and then get your permission. And if we can, we'll just let everybody know where to access it. But I just want to thank you for your time. Thank you for all the information that you've shared with us. It looks like we're going to have to call you back sooner rather than later, because there's quite a lot on the go and there's a lot to unpack, and certainly very useful information for all of us in the financial services sector, and also just as human beings in the African continent. So thank you, Daniel, for your time, and thank you to everybody that logged on today. See, we had 661 people on the call. Thank you for taking your time to join us. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to email us at iTOO, and we'll be sure to pass those on to Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. Enjoy the rest of your iTOOsday, and we'll see you next week again. Thanks.